gather around. We're continuing our study in the book of Deuteronomy, so if you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open them to Deuteronomy chapter 12. We're going to be actually going through a number of different verses, and so if you do have them, I tried to get as many of these verses up here on the board as possible, but it's just not possible, I guess. I could have, but we're going to be focusing in on this particular section of the topics around civil officials and offerings. But we're really going to start back in chapter 12 to kind of bring all of this together. And I kind of wrote it down in this format to kind of help us just from a contextual, trying to get context of where we are within our study. I felt it'd be good to kind of just review this really quickly. But in the first 5 chapters and the classes that we had, this was Moses' opportunity to really kind of let the new generation have this understanding of how they had gotten up to this point to where they were about to go into the promised land. And a lot of the focus that we were trying to help the class understand was that God was with them through it all, whether that they were disobedient from the point of coming out of Mount Sinai, which was their parents, and all of the things that they had gone through. And then once this new generation was coming to the promised land, through it all, God was with them. God was leading them. God came to them, and God was teaching them all through that. And that was really Moses' attempt within the first 5 chapters to help them recognize how much God was with them through it all. In chapters 6 through 12, it was really this understanding of the response that Moses wanted to the fact that God had done all of these things for them. And throughout Deuteronomy, we see this constant reminder of the Egyptian, the freedom that they got from the Egyptian slavery, the release from there, and it was just this response to everything that God had done for them. And we talked about loving God, obeying God, and showing gratitude to God, and really ultimately this fear of God. And it really kind of stemmed from that initial response of fearing God, but it was really more of recognizing that you're not really afraid of Him, but more in reverence to Him and recognizing His power and recognizing who He is. And that in turn will help you recognize that you should be grateful, that you should obey Him, and that you should love Him with all of your heart, soul, and mind. And so now we're getting into the part of Deuteronomy that is really around a lot of the laws and the explanation that Moses is trying to give to the next generation and help them understand what it is that they're going to be doing. And last week, HE was able to get through this worship and obedience section. Today we're going through civil officials and offerings, and cities of refuge, waging of war, and miscellaneous laws is really the basis of what we're going to try to encompass within these several chapters here in the middle of Deuteronomy. But the goals for the class is really to help us understand who God is and who Jesus ultimately was, and kind of give us support around who He was, and a lot of the stuff that was talked about in not only the Lord's Supper talk, but also what Daniel did kind of help, tee us up for what we're going to be talking about today. But we are also going to try to understand who we are supposed to be as Christians, as children of God, and things like that. And hopefully we'll have some application. So like I said, open your books to Deuteronomy chapter 12. This is really, again, just a quick run through, and so I'm going to be pointing to a lot of different verses, and it's, I think, better for you to kind of see them, hopefully, and as we kind of go through these things so that you can kind of read them and see them. But I'll try to put references to them up here. I think I did that. So Deuteronomy chapter 12 was really around this worship and gratitude and obedience. And we talked about just the idea that everything that was in there, we needed to be careful with it because we needed to observe everything. There was this idea, this topic, or this understanding: be careful with the commandments of God. Be careful to observe them, for it's going to help you. It's going to be well for you to actually be doing these things. And a lot of the choices that you make on whether or not you decide to do them, there was this imagery at the end of, I think, chapter 4, where he said, we discussed this idea that you have this choice. Going into the promised land, you'll see a mountain that will take you in the wrong path, and you'll have this mountain that will take you into the good path. And it was this understanding of making sure that you obey and are careful with these commandments that He gives you. and kind of ultimately this worship and gratitude and obedience in these choices that you make. And in chapter 12, specifically verses 7, 12, and 18, in every call to worship, there is this, if you look at those verses, there's this call to this gratitude. And by taking all of these blessings that you've been given and taking them to the Lord, and you go and rejoice in front of the Lord. And it talks about in these verses this specific location that God is going to give them to say, hey, take all of the things that you've gotten up to this point. I want you to take it to this specific location that God wants, and you partake in those things in front of the Lord. And here's verse 7. It says, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your household, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. It was funny because when I was actually preparing this specific slide, I happened to be warming up my lunch. And when I kind of sat back down and I had my lunch in front of me, I normally try to say a prayer. And, I think that a lot of us do. And I almost felt like it was a little different because I tried to imagine myself kind of as these Israelites would be. It's like they're taking their blessings, they're taking everything that they have and going in front of the Lord in the specific location and rejoicing and partaking in front of Him. And, when I said that prayer, it just seemed different because I was trying to imagine myself as being in front of the Lord and being there with Him and being in the presence. And sometimes I think we do these prayers and we do these things before we eat, almost in a routine fashion, just because we do it a lot and we just kind of get through it. But I'd encourage you to really kind of think, about those things. And most of you probably do this. Maybe it's just a bad habit of myself, but it just felt different. I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it was what I think these verses Moses was trying to get to them, or God, by having them institute this specific, request to take your blessings and go and partake it with Him. I think that was the intent of it. And we'll actually see some more verses that kind of enforce that idea later on. But chapter 12 also talked about this concept of utterly destroying the inhabitants. There in verse 2, if you read that. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. And I think the reason that God wanted the Israelite nation to completely and utterly destroy everything was because up until that point, if you look in verse 8, it says everybody did exactly what they wanted. Whatever they wanted to do, whatever was good in their own eyes, that's what they did. And so for them to go in and completely take out everything, I think that was the intent of them kind of removing this temptation of potentially worshiping whatever they did in that new land, whatever God that they worshiped, however they did it. That was God wanted them to remove that temptation to actually do what they were doing. And I think even maybe a little deeper than that, there was even this potential that they would potentially worship our God in the way that they were worshiping those gods. And so He didn't want them to even worship them in the wrong way by having these temptations or these other people within the lands that they were about to overtake. And you can see this in chapter 12, verses 30 through 31. It says, Take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how does these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination to the Lord which He hates they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to the gods. And so there's this understanding that, if we're surrounded by these things, if we see these things, that we, just as individuals, can be influenced by those things and kind of be taken in the wrong direction. So I think in essence, the people were to worship God in the place that He chose. We talked about that earlier, but there's this idea that God was to dwell there and that He was going to rejoice with them as they took these things, these blessings and these things in front of Him. And I think, as we all know, God eventually kind of named this location. They built a temple. And I think maybe the application for us today is this idea that we are seeking where God has put his name, the place that he chose, because there's no temple now. It's like, where do we go to rejoice with him? And John chapter 14, verse 6 says, Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so for us today, how do we rejoice with God? Well, that's through worship and through obedience to Jesus. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll stop there because my mouth is getting a little dry. But any questions or comments or anything? And my back is really hurting, and so if I sit down and you can't see me anymore, just sorry. I don't know. I hurt my back really bad, and it's not good. But yeah, any questions, comments? Did that stir up anything? Any concerns? Okay. Let's see. What else? So yeah, as we continue through these verses, chapter 12 and chapter 13, we see this call to obedience there in verse 3 of chapter 13. It says, "You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and with all your soul." And so this is talking about the false prophets and things that were happening within the region, but there's this call that, we are expected to be obedient. Don't listen to these false prophets. You need to stay away from them. But there's also this reminder there within these calls to obedience, that this focus on this idea that they were delivered from Egypt. Every time Moses talks about something that happened in the past, it was this reminder. It's like, hey, you guys were slaves in Egypt. You guys, remember what God did for you. Now he delivered you from Egypt. And then we get to chapter 14. There in verse 1, you have what I kind of feel is just a little of a summary statement of why God expects so much out of the Israelite nation, out of us as Christians. And it says, chapter 14, verse 1 says, "You are the children of the Lord your God." And verse 2 says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." And so up to this point, I don't think that Moses has specifically said that the Israelite nations were the children, but he kind of insinuated that by saying, God treated you as a father treats a son, and kind of had this picture of how they are sons of God, but never really outright kind of told them. This is really the first time that Moses tells them that they're the sons of the Lord, or that they're children of the Lord, and because of that, they have this special relationship with God, and because of this, it kind of goes to what Daniel was kind of preaching about earlier today about your planning. It's like every aspect of our lives will be affected by this idea that we are children of God, that they were sons of the Lord. And then it kind of, if you were to read verse 4, I think it's chapter 14, verse 1, it talks, all of a sudden it starts talking about you're children of God, so don't do these things to your body. Well, there's every aspect of our lives. It includes our bodies. It's like, what do we do with our bodies? And that kind of goes back to them. Well, there's a verse 1. It says, "Don't cut yourself or shave your head," because it was this improper mourning. But there's also, I think that's kind of put in there because back to this idea about no idol worship or anything like that. Once you go in, you got to utterly destroy them. There was a lot of worship that kind of entailed this concept of doing things to your body in order for that God to be able to do whatever it is that you needed. And so there was this concept that you shouldn't do any of that. I mean, there's things that are expected of you because you do have this relationship with God, and there's aspects that every part of your life will be affected by this concept that you are children of God. So I'll stop there. There's more coming, but I'm going to take a breather. Any thoughts or questions or anything? I feel like I'm going fast. We're going to run out of stuff to talk about. Okay. So don't do this. You are holy people, verse 2. Yeah. And the fact that we are children of God, the fact that we are sons of the Lord, even what they eat will be affected. And that's why it goes, as you continue to read chapter 14, it starts talking about eating this or eating that. Don't eat this, don't eat that. And I think the lesson here is that even the mundane things or the things that we wouldn't think are important are touched and influenced by the fact that we are children of God, that we are a holy people. And this whole section kind of starts off with this idea that we are sons of God, that we are a holy people, and it kind of ends with that same, there in verse 21, kind of ends with this: you shall eat not anything that dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who's within your gate, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. And so we were supposed to be different. We're supposed to be separate. Supposed to just look different and be different. And, again, it just affects everything that we do. So let's see. So at the end of chapter 14, it kind of goes into tithing. And even that, again, being children of God will change the way that we use our riches. And we, every Sunday we give an opportunity here for the church to give things. But there's this call within these verses, this call to rejoice in front of the Lord by bringing it to Him. In every aspect of where they're in the description of what they're supposed to be doing with their tithing, they're supposed to gather it and take it to this location that God wanted in there and rejoice for Him. And there in verse 23, it says why you want to do this. It's because that you may fear the Lord your God always. And it kind of goes back to my thought around, the difference in the way that I felt when I was praying that prayer just for my lunch. It felt different in the sense, not that I feared Him, but it was more this reverence and this awe for, man, I have the ease to go to a microwave and microwave a frozen leftover dinner that we had the other day. And it's easy for me to do that. And, that's really mundane, maybe unimportant, but, it is something that I think that we as children need to recognize, that everything that we do, everything that we touch, every aspect of our life is somewhat influenced by this idea that we should be different, that we should look at things differently, and that we should act differently. So then it kind of goes into sharing this tithing with the Levites, with the fatherless, and with the widows, and helping them recognize that it's more about also this giving piece of it. And that kind of goes into the flow of what's happening in chapter 15, where you have this releasing of debts. He starts talking about releasing debts every 7 years. So if you can remember that everything that we have, all of our food, all of our riches, all these blessings come from God, it also would probably help our hearts to almost be soft and be okay with this idea of releasing debts, because it's probably a hard thing to do if somebody owes you a lot of stuff, to release debts every 7 years. But wouldn't that be something if we had that instilled still today? It'd be real nice. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Any thoughts or comments or questions or anything? And then we get into chapter 16, where we move into this explanation of what Moses is trying to give them, what this view is going to look like, or what it's going to look like once they're in the promised land. And kind of starts reviewing all of these festivals that they're very familiar with, but he wanted to just kind of bring them back to the forefront. And I think it kind of connects closely to what they were talking about in chapter 15 around the debts, because if you think about what he's saying here, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover for the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. And so it goes back to this idea that they were slaves, they were bondage, they had this debt, and he took it away from them, and kind of connects with that freeing of slaves and debts that happened in verse 15. He also talks about the Feast of Weeks. Again, it's just this, you shall rejoice, verse 16, verse 11, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. Take all your things to him. And again, it talks about verse 12, that you were slaves in Egypt. He continues to go back to this idea that, you had look at everything that God has done for you. And you have this Feast of Tabernacles, verse 15, 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord your God in the places which the Lord chooses. And it's just a reminder of the blessing that God has given them. Then we get into chapter 16, which is our study for today. So hopefully that quick context kind of gets our mind kind of flowing into this idea of this justice and righteousness that we're going to look at. But we're actually going to read starting in chapter 16, verse 18, and we're going to take it through 17. But what I want you to kind of think about or try to recognize as we read through it, there's going to be this description of justice that we're going to be reading. What does it look like? How is it defined whenever we read it? And there's going to be instructions related to that justice. And so what sort of rules are implemented to support that justice and kind of identify a use case for these instructions that are in there. So as I read, hopefully you can kind of think about those things and hopefully get something out of it. So let's start in chapter 16, verse 18 through 22. So you shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. You shall follow what is altogether just, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant for yourself any tree as a wooden image near the altar which you build for yourself to the Lord your God. You shall not set up a sacred pillar which the Lord your God hates. Chapter 17, you shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or a sheep which has blemishes or a defect, for this is an abomination to the Lord your God. If there is found among you, within any of your gates, which the Lord your God gives you, a man or a woman who has been wicked in the sights of the Lord your God, in transgressing his covenant, who has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, either the sun or moon or any of the hosts of heaven, which I have not commanded, and it is told you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire diligently. And if it's indeed true and certain that such an abomination has been committed in Israel, then you shall bring out to your gates that man or woman who has committed the wicked thing, and you shall stone to death that man or that woman with stones. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you. If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gate, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judges there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which the Lord chooses. And you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgments which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right or to the left from the sentence which they pronounce upon you. Now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer attempt presumptuously. So, description of justice. What do they have to do first? There in verse 1. You can just yell it out. You guys are still awake. Appoint judges and officers, yes. And how does Moses describe how they should judge? Not distort, yeah. Righteous. What else is in there? Don't take a bribe. Yeah. Yeah. Judge with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice. That's what my Bible said. And, don't show partiality. Thou shalt not take a bribe, and follow what is all together just, there in verse 20. There were some examples there of wickedness that we saw. What were those? No, it was there in what we read. He all of a sudden kind of started going into examples of this wickedness. It was related to God. Yeah.
Read the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
When you read the prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah and others condemning Judah and Israel, Judah in particular here, a particular condemnation came upon the judges because they did show partiality and they did practice evil, and it was part of the ruin of the nation. And the people had no recourse because the judges were a tool for oppression, as we can see in present-day America.
Yeah, that's for sure. What were some examples in this the reading that we just had?
Idol.
The idols, yeah. Idols. They told them no wooden images, no sacred pillars, right? And then there in verse 17, he talked specifically about this, don't sacrifice this blemishes or defects. And it kind of, there in verse 2, it says, if any of these are found among you, within you, the gates, a man or a woman has been wicked in the sight of the Lord. And he's trying to bring in all of this wickedness, but he gave examples of it. But it was all specific to how they worship God. And it kind of goes back to the previous chapters where he was talking about idol worship, get rid of everything that was in there. There's instruction related to justice. It said, any wickedness, bring them and stone them. Capital punishment kind of was somewhat started, I guess, there in verse 5, possibly. Any wickedness, you need to bring them up to the front. But what was it that they had to do first before they did that? We read in the scriptures.
You need 2 or 3 witnesses.
Yeah. Yep. You need 2 or 3 witnesses, but you need to inquire diligently, right? You need to ask questions first, almost this concept of, innocent until proven guilty, maybe. But yeah, there's this testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses that was needed, and what was and this was an interesting thing there in verse 7. What do you think the reason was that God instituted this idea that, if you're one of the witnesses, you're the first one that's going to throw the stone? Why do you think he did that?
Because the
Pressure? The
guilt,
conscience?
the
Go ahead,
guilt-
Mike.
I guess the guilt would be turned back on you if you were wrong.
If you were lying,
wrongfully
yeah.
accusing that
Yeah.
person,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
you're murdering him.
Yeah. I think that it doesn't explicitly say that, but I'm assuming that's, partial reason as to why that was, part of it, because, it goes back to that scene where Jesus says, if you're not a sinner, or if you're, I can't remember, pick up the first stone and throw it at him, and nobody did. Go ahead, Rick. Save me. Reasonable doubt, yeah.
I'm going to be throwing the first stone unless I'm totally convinced.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pursue this any further because I got to be the first one to throw a stone. So,
Yeah, that's a
and
good
that
point.
would also show devotion to God, that I'm doing what He asks. That's one thing to remember. We love God when we keep His commandments. So there's love of God shown by doing that. That's conviction that the person was wrong, and it's the care for the purity of the congregation of Israel that you keep evil out of it.
Yeah, very good point. Any other comments on this section here? Oh yeah, stoned to death, hand of the first witness. Oh yeah, and I was just giving the example here. Verse 8 talks about this, take these hard cases to the Lord, the place that He chooses, and basically, once they make the decision, the priests and the priests there, or the judges, you're supposed to do exactly what they say, as long as they're just leaders, do and don't go against it. Verse 11. So let's keep reading there in chapter 17, and this was something that H.E. I think this was the part, maybe not, but no, it's a little later, I think. So principles, chapter 17, we're going to read the rest of 14 through 20. It's really around the principles governing the king, and so let's just read that, hopefully real quick. Starting in verse 14, it says, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the ones before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be filled above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. And so there's key characteristics of God's description of a king. What were they? You can just yell them out again if you saw them. I'm going to start calling on people. He's chosen by God. Yes, God has to choose him. What else was in there? Got to be part of the, yes, must not be a foreigner. Must be part of the brethren. Must be a brother. Must be part of the countrymen. What else was there? What's that? He needs to know the words of God, yes. Not greedy. Wasn't the next one on my list. I'm not clicking, but we'll get there. Can't have many wives. What else can he not look for? Lots of horses, yeah, and he can't encourage people to go back to Egypt. But yeah, horses, must not acquire many horses, must not acquire many wives, must not acquire many riches. And to Michael's point, verse 18, which I think is a key one, he must write for himself a copy of this law. Write for it. He's got to write it. And I don't know if there's really any place that kind of says that any of these kings ever did this, but why would you think this is important? Knowing, yeah. Have you ever sat down and written down a chapter of the Bible? Yeah. If you ever really want to study a chapter or study the scripture, write it down. I'd encourage you to write it down. Because there's one thing to read it, and reading is very good, and trying this memorization, but writing it down almost brings this different connection to what you're looking at, what you're reading, what you're seeing. Writing it down is almost, brings it into your heart a little bit. And I think that's what God wanted in all of us, that he wanted this word in our heart. And so writing it down is definitely part of it. How did these kings that we are familiar with do in regards to these descriptions? How did Saul do? What was his characteristic? Why did the Israelite nation want him? He was tall, he was rich. Had a lot of... David did a little bit better, I guess. Solomon, how did he do in all of this? He started out with a big disappointment, yeah. Yeah.
Solomon's wives led him away from the Lord, just like it says in this text. It's almost as though it was written specifically for well, we know it was written for the kings, but especially I think of Solomon when I read this text.
Yeah. Verse 19 says he must read all the days of his life so that he may learn to fear the Lord. And so, just reading, writing it down is, something that will help all of us, I think, learn to fear. And I think that's the goal for all of us as Christians as we take our walk through our lives. So chapter 18 quickly goes through this view into what the priests look like. He was talking about that they should have no inheritance, that their inheritance was the Lord's inheritance. And you get this quick understanding of what was due to the priests from the blessings that were brought from all of the offerings and things like that. And it goes back to the comments about bring your blessings to the specific location and partake of them in front of the Lord. Last week, at the beginning of this chapter, H.E. kind of reviewed a lot of this last week, but there in verse 15 talks about the Lord will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. It was this concept that you wanted this, just like you wanted in Horeb, he will speak all the commands to you. If you recall the scene where they were at Mount Sinai and that they were very afraid of God, and they were saying, don't let us hear him speak anymore. We need you to go up there and find out what he wants us to do, and we'll do whatever he tells us. And they're saying here, just like you wanted back in Horeb, we're going to raise up for your prophet just like me. And so if we think about that, just like Moses, another one will raise up that will be a mediator like Moses was. There's another prophet that's going to have access to the presence of the Lord like Moses had. And there's going to be another prophet that can converse with the Lord like Moses. There's going to be a prophet that has the spirit of prophecy to speak the words of God. And so Moses is telling them here that there's going to be another. And so trying to bring all of these last few verses kind of all together and why we see this concept of worship, obedience, and this description of prophets and priests and everything. God's people, in essence, are supposed to be holy. We are the children of God. There are certain responsibilities to this holiness that we are expected to have, and again, as we said earlier, it's this concept of every aspect of our life should be different. Everything that we do should be on the basis of what this understanding that we're children of God. Every decision that we make. And God should dictate every aspect of our lives and not just what we're doing on Sundays. Everything that we do comes under God's governance and God's guidance. So Moses kind of wanted them to come into this land and be this different people, set apart and special in that way. And by helping them understand that they were children of God and help them understand how they were a holy people, help them to potentially, hopefully, make good decisions. But we know that they didn't, but that was the intent. And we also find through all of these chapters that God's appointed leader that's being described is very different than what we have. Moses is describing a king that when he came, he would rule with this righteousness and justice, and we understand what that means because we kind of went through this understanding of what justice means, what it looks like, what we expect. And so there's going to be this king that will come and rule with this righteousness and justice. And there's almost this longing for the people for a leader that comes to serve in this righteousness and justice. And we have that same, I think, longing today, here, even today. We want somebody that will be just, that will be righteous, that will hopefully have, the understanding of what God's will is within just our own nation. But unfortunately, the descriptions that we see here today kind of contrast what truly happened with all of the judges and the priests, as Brian kind of stated. A lot of them were corrupt. A lot of them, did things that were specific for themselves and didn't really come out to the way that was kind of described here. But with all of these, with God's words, we're kind of seeing this picture of this ideal king and really what it's supposed to be. And kind of Moses is telling them that there's going to be this one that kind of fills this role of this righteous judge and kind of comes and is going to be able to deal with these debts that they have. And so Deuteronomy is really setting up the people so when they come into the land that they realize that everyone that they have appointed to these roles, they're really unfit and really unable to do those things. And all of the failures that we see in Israel, that you kind of help us realize that we need God to do these things, that there's no ruler that will come and rule in this righteousness and in this justice that's kind of defined here within these chapters. And this is what God wanted them to see, so that we don't put our hope in the world, in the people of this world, trying to find that person that will do exactly what they're supposed to do, or find that priest that's supposed to be only doing these things, or that prophet that always tells us exactly what was, or tell them, I guess, what was supposed to be told. But we need this perfect king, we need this perfect prophet, and we need this perfect priest, and this will set us up for what Jesus is really going to fulfill for us whenever he comes. I think this is the last slide. So when we study these chapters in Deuteronomy, we'll begin to see or have a wider view into who Jesus really was and what he came to do. Jesus kind of fits this role of everything that we need. He's the only one that fits what we need. Every king that came, every prophet that came, every priest that came, showed us that there's no one really that can fit that role. Only Jesus can. And so hopefully all of that review and kind of bring it all together. I know it was a lot, but hopefully that kind of helps you recognize why he's kind of going through all of these things in this book of Deuteronomy around civil laws, how you should worship, what you should do with the priests, what you should do with the tithings, and everything like that, and your description of the king. So, any comments or questions? I think we have a couple of minutes. Any concerns with any of that? Brian has a concern? I'm kidding.
Just a random thought that passed my mind, but the key word that we read in these passages was God chooses.
Mm-hmm.
So it was God that chose Israel and calls them his sons. And it's God that chooses the kings, of which it points to us because it is God that chooses us for salvation, 2 Thessalonians 2:13. It is God that appoints us to be his sons, Ephesians chapter 1, I think about verse 3 and 4. It's God that appointed Jesus. And so what we're seeing is God's choice being exercised through his word in the old law as a prophetic figure of what was to come under the new covenant. Because in the King James we're called the elect or the chosen. And those who are with Christ out of Revelations are the called, the chosen, and the faithful.
Yeah.
Chosen by God.
Yeah. Good thoughts. Anything else? All right. Well, I guess you guys are out of class early. Go get a hall pass, and you guys can get out of here. Thank you for your attention.